9 of the 10 winningest teams in NFL history have won a Super Bowl, with all 9 winning multiple. The Cowboys, Steelers, Ravens, Packers, Chiefs, Patriots, Niners, Dolphins, and Broncos all have at least 2 titles.
We're bringing this sucker home!
But one team, despite having the 4th highest win percentage in NFL history, doesn't have a single Lombardi to their name. And the major question is, why? Was it due to a destructive trade that changed the course of their franchise? Perhaps it was due to a 2-decade-long grudge one franchise held against them. Or maybe it was just plain bad luck. Regardless of the reason, one thing is for sure, it hasn't been for a lack of trying. This team has been to the show 4 times, and every time has fallen short.
One of the NFL's best teams never to win a Super Bowl.
This team is the Minnesota Vikings. The Minnesota Vikings were founded as an expansion team in 1960 and started play the following season. The Vikings were initially set to join the AFL if it weren't for George Halas, owner of the Bears, who changed the NFL's constitution. Halas fought to add the Vikings, but one owner wanted to keep the Vikings out. So Halas, determined to expand, pushed for a unanimous vote to be removed. He was successful, and the Vikings were accepted to the NFL. Ironically, the Vikings' first game was against Halas' Bears, and even more ironic was that rookie Fran Tarkenton came off the bench in their first game against the franchise and helped the Vikings defeat Chicago, 37-13. The 1960s were the Fran Tarkenton era, a scrambler from the University of Georgia. Tarkenton was tremendous, but this was during an era where the league frowned upon QBs for scrambling, so the view of Tarkenton by Minnesota coaching, at least in the early years, wasn't always a fond one. In their first season, the Vikings went 3-11, and had only one winning season in their first 5 years as a franchise. Norm Van Brocklin was the coach at the time, as well as the first coach for the Minnesota Vikings, and he took over the year after he won an NFL championship with the Eagles. The Van Brocklin era for the Vikings was a struggle, no more perfectly exemplified by the play where superstar Jim Marshall scooped up a fumble and returned it the wrong way in 1964. After a few poor seasons to start out the history of the Minnesota Vikings, Van Brocklin resigned in 1965, but then came back after being begged by Minnesota Viking leadership. The major issue was that Van Brocklin hated Tarkenton's scrambling, and this caused a rocky relationship between the coach and quarterback. In 1966, the first year of the Super Bowl era, the Vikings continued to struggle, and at the end of the year, Tarkenton wanted a trade. Van Brocklin tried to change his mind, actually, but ultimately it didn't work. As a result, Van Brocklin retired, and Tarkenton was traded. While things seemed grim, there was a bright spot. Bud Grant, who took over as coach in 1967. Bud was actually drafted in both the NFL by the Eagles and the NBA by the Lakers, the Minneapolis Lakers, and played in the NBA for 2 seasons before returning to the Eagles to play football. In his second season as coach, the Vikings finished with an 8-6 record and a playoff berth in 1968. Joe Kapp was the new QB, taking over for Tarkenton, and in their first playoff game against the Colts, one of the muddiest games in NFL history, the Vikings lost, 24-14. In 1969, after Bud Grant's culture had taken hold, the Vikings finished 12-2, the best record in the NFL, and one of the greatest, if not the greatest, defensive lines in NFL history, the Purple People Eaters, finally took hold. They were Jim Marshall, who the Vikings traded for just prior to 1961, Carl Eller, drafted 6th overall by the Vikings in 1964, Alan Page, another first-round draft pick in 67, and Gary Larson, who the Vikings received as a throw-in in a trade with the Rams. In the back end, the Vikings also had Paul Krause, a stud safety, who they traded for in 1968, and who still stands as the league's all-time career interceptions leader. In 69, the Purple People Eaters were one of only 2 groups in NFL history to allow 9.5 or less points per game, and the offense also led the league in scoring in 1969. In their first ever home playoff game against the Rams, they were down 10 at halftime, but Joe Kapp led a Vikings comeback, and Carl Eller all but sealed it with a sack safety. But the Rams, unfortunately, had one more shot, and while driving down to kick a field goal to force OT, Alan Page stepped in front of a pass to seal the game for good with an interception. Minnesota is cold, obviously, and in the next playoff game, Bud Grant wildly removed heaters from his team's sideline to intimidate the opposition. This decision was crazy. The game was so cold that the refs' whistles froze and the electronic scoreboard didn't work. Yet, it seemed to work, for the Vikings at least, as the Vikings routed the Browns in a 27-7 win. Now, the Vikings had reached their first ever Super Bowl, Super Bowl IV, just 8 years after their founding. In the Vikings' first Super Bowl, they matched up with Kansas City and were 13-point favorites. After all, they led the league in scoring and had the league's best defense. But it was a rocky start for the Vikings, as KC took a 16-0 lead at halftime. And although Minnesota scored in the second half to pull within 9, the Chiefs scored again to pull ahead 23-7. And after 3 more interceptions were thrown by Vikings QBs, the Chiefs were winners of Super Bowl IV at the final score of 23-7. In 1970, the vaunted Vikings defense was back. They only gave up 10 touchdowns in 1970, and the defense, by itself, scored 7. That season, they were the only team in the Super Bowl era to not allow more than 20 points in any single game. Yet, with all the defensive accomplishments, the offense struggled after Joe Kapp failed to sign an extension with the team. Gary Quazzo had taken over, but struggled in the new starting role, and even with the lack of offensive firepower, the team still managed to make the playoffs. In their first playoff game that season, the Vikings matched up with the 49ers. The Vikings offense struggled, and although Paul Krause scored on a fumble return early, Minnesota mustered little offensively until the end of the game, and lost 17-14. The next season, the defense continued to hum. In 1971, Alan Page won league MVP, the first defensive player to ever do so, and it's only been done once since. Yet, the offense still struggled with Quazzo as quarterback, and after some really poor play, he was inevitably benched for Bob Lee. In the 1971 divisional round against Dallas, a few questionable officiating calls and offensive incompetency led to Minnesota's demise again, 20-12.
And Dallas won this 7th and most important meeting between 2 superb teams.
The postseason heartbreak continued for Minnesota, but there was one bright spot. In 1972, the prodigal son, Fran Tarkenton, returned, and the Vikings' Super Bowl aspirations were back on after winning 4 straight division titles. Upon his return, the Vikings decided to build their offense around Tarkenton's special abilities, but even with their favorite signal caller back, the first season with Tarkenton under center was mediocre, as the Vikings finished 7-7 in 1972, partially due to the defense taking a step back, but also due to the woes of kicker Fred Cox, when 5 of their losses were by 3 points, and in 4 of those games, Cox missed critical kicks that would have given Minnesota the win. In 1973, the Vikings were back. They won 9 straight to start the season. Tarkenton was in top form, and the Vikings would not be stopped, winning 12 games in 73, 9 of which were by a double-digit margin. In their first playoff game against the defending conference champions Washington, down 7-3 at halftime, the Vikings scored right out of the break, going ahead 10-7. After allowing another touchdown, Minnesota scored 14 unanswered to retake an 11-point lead, 24-13. When it was all said and done, the Vikings emerged victorious, 27-20. In playoff game number 2 of 1973 against Dallas, the Vikings weren't messing around, grabbing an early 10-0 lead and carrying it into the half. In the second half, Minnesota outscored Dallas 17-10, including a pick 6 on their 4th interception of the day, and closed out the Cowboys 27-10. Minnesota was headed back to the Super Bowl. In the big game against Miami, who went undefeated the previous season and were defending Super Bowl champs, the Dolphins drove right down the field to take a 7-0 lead. After a Vikings 3-and-out, the Dolphins marched the ball down the field again, taking a 14-0 lead. Miami added another field goal and were up 17-0 at half. The Vikings and Dolphins exchanged blows in the second half, making the score 24-7, which would hold through the end of the game. The Dolphins had repeated, and the Purple People Eaters were now 0-2 in Super Bowls. In 1974, the strike by NFL players, which Alan Page was at the forefront of, put a damper on things, but ultimately, the owners temporarily won out, and the season carried on. That season, the Vikings won their division again, their 6th division title in 7 seasons, and finished 10-4. Highlighted by Tarkenton hilariously throwing the ball at the back of a Patriot player's head, which, ironically enough, gave the Patriots what they needed to score and win the game on the ensuing drive. In their first playoff game of 1974 against the St. Louis Football Cardinals, the score was tied 7-7 at half, until a defensive touchdown and an offensive outburst pulled the Vikings ahead for good, with a 30-14 victory. In their second straight NFC title game, the Vikings jumped out to a 7-3 lead. And after an incredible goal line stand on a 98-yard Rams drive, followed by a touchdown of their own, the Vikings took a 14-3 lead. And their defense came up huge after a Rams touchdown made the game close, helping Minnesota secure their second straight NFC crown, 14-10. The Vikings were headed back to the Super Bowl. In their third attempt, this time against Pittsburgh, the game was a defensive battle in the first half, with Pittsburgh scoring on a safety in the second quarter and then intercepting Fran Tarkenton deep in their own territory to hold a 2-point lead at the break. In the second half, Franco Harris scored to make it 9-0. On the following Vikings drive, a wild play ensued, when Tarkenton caught his own pass that was batted by a Steelers defender, and then proceeded to launch it again for a deep completion that was nullified, thanks to the one forward pass rule. Tarkenton was later intercepted on the same drive, and after coming up short on a later drive, the Vikings scored on a block punt, pulling to within 3 of Pittsburgh, with the score 9-6. With Pittsburgh trying to grind out the clock, they inexplicably fumbled, and the ball was ruled to be recovered by Minnesota, until an official, far from the play, overruled them, wildly giving the ball back to Pittsburgh. The Steelers scored on the same drive, and then a Tarkenton interception sealed it for Pittsburgh. Minnesota was now 0-3 in Super Bowls, after their 16-6 loss. In 1975, the Vikings dominated again, with a top 3 offense and defense. Minnesota rolled to a 12-2 record. Tarkenton set the career completion and touchdown records, surpassing Unitas in both categories. In the 75 divisional round, Minnesota matched up with Dallas for the third time. After Minnesota took a 7-0 lead into the break, Dallas scored on their first drive to tie the game, and added another 3 on the next drive to take the lead. The Vikings offense put something together late in the fourth, taking a 14-10 lead, and forced a 3-and-out on the ensuing drive. After another punt by the Vikings, Dallas was down to their last chance. On a 4th and 16, Staubach and the Cowboys made a miraculous play that wasn't without controversy to convert the 4th down. Then, with 32 seconds left, Staubach and Pearson made a play that would live forever in NFL lore. This, of course, is the famous Hail Mary, in which Staubach himself was quoted saying he said a Hail Mary prior to the play. Roger threw it up for Pearson. It kicked off a Minnesota Vikings player leg, and then unbelievably found its way into Pearson's hand for the game-winning touchdown. After the game, Pearson all but admitted to committing offensive pass interference on the play, but the official swallowed his whistle, and the Vikings were out of the playoffs again. This game and that play will go down as one of the greatest what-if moments in Minnesota Vikings history. This team was believed to be better than those in years prior, and the path to the Vikings' first Super Bowl was a very realistic one. The OPI by Drew Pearson that never was haunted Vikings players. It haunted Bud Grant, and it has continued to haunt Minnesota Vikings fans for decades. The next year, many felt as though 76 would be the Vikings' last chance, as a litany of Vikings stars had grown old. It was the Purple People Eater's last chance. The beauty of 76, though, was the prime of Chuck Foreman, one of the greatest running backs in Vikings history. In 76, the Vikings finished the regular season at 11-2-1, the best in their conference, for the 6th time in 7 years since the merger. In the divisional round, the Vikings faced off against Washington. Minnesota jumped on Washington early and often, taking a 21-3 lead into the break. It would not be denied in the second half, beating Washington 35-6. In the NFC Championship, the Vikings cruised to a 17-point lead, thanks to a blocked field goal return for a touchdown, a blocked punt that led to a field goal, and a nice touchdown drive. In the second half, though, the Rams came storming back, pulling within 4, and had the ball, down 17-13, late in the fourth quarter. On a 4th and long, the Vikings defense would stand tough, as Bobby Bryant saved the game with an interception. On the ensuing drive, the Vikings would add one more touchdown, beating the Rams 24-13, to send them to their 4th Super Bowl. In Super Bowl 11, against the Raiders and legendary coach John Madden, this appeared to be the Vikings' last shot. After a mostly defensive first quarter, Minnesota blocked another punt, their 16th block kick of the season, and started the drive at the Raiders' 3-yard line. But things quickly went sideways, as Brent McClanahan fumbled, which the Raiders recovered and quickly turned into 3 points, a possible 10-point swing in favor of the Raiders. In the second quarter, the Vikings offense stalled out, and the Raiders cashed in for 2 touchdowns, taking a 16-0 lead at halftime. The Raiders added another field goal, going up 19-0, but the Vikings answered. The score was now 19-7. The Vikings defense held tough after their touchdown, but on their ensuing offensive possession, Tarkenton threw an interception, a huge blow to the Vikings' comeback hopes. The Raiders scored off the interception, and after trading 2 touchdowns late, Minnesota would fall to the Raiders, 32-14. They would fail to convert on their last Super Bowl chance in this era, and would fall to a staggering 0-4 in Super Bowl appearances. A truly heartbreaking result for fans of a tremendous team that was dominant for so long. The Vikings would win one more playoff game in '77 over LA, but the incredible '70s teams that filled fans with so much joy and heartache would fail to accomplish much more after their last playoff win in '77. The Vikings lost to the eventual Super Bowl champion Cowboys in the NFC Championship, and a couple years later, Alan Page was waived. He landed with division rival Chicago, where he would continue to dominate for 3 more years, and the Vikings dynasty that could have been officially ended at the turn of the decade. In the 80s, Tommy Kramer, the Vikings' first ever first-round pick at quarterback, who they selected in the 1977 draft, took over for Tarkenton, and after trading for receiver Ahmad Rashad, the Vikings had a couple new offensive stars. In 1980, the Vikings entered Week 15 at 8-6, needing a win over the Browns to clinch the division, with Detroit hot on their heels. They trailed late against the Browns, down 23-15, which, of course, was a 2-score lead until 1994, when the NFL finally instated the 2-point conversion. After a touchdown to pull within 1, the Vikings failed on the onside kick attempt, but managed to force a 3-and-out. With 20 seconds left at their own 20, Minnesota needed a miracle. They amazingly completed a hook and ladder that took them into Browns territory with 6 seconds left, and on the final play of the game, sealed the division on a miraculous Hail Mary to Ahmad Rashad. Ironic, right? In the playoffs, the Vikings jumped out to a 14-0 lead, and even after the Eagles stormed back to tie it, the Vikings would ultimately force a safety, retaking the lead. Then, the Vikings muffed a punt on a later drive, and the Eagles cashed in on the fumble to take a 21-16 lead. On the next 2 drives, the teams amazingly traded fumble recoveries, only for the Vikings to fumble the ball back to the Eagles again. Yes, that's now 3 Vikings fumbles, and 4 overall. What would happen next was even more incredible. The teams traded interceptions, increasing the turnover total in the game to 9, including the safety. The Eagles, of course, said hold my beer, throwing an interception on the next drive, only for Kramer to say hold my beer again, throwing the ball back to Philly. Turnover totals were now at 11. Philly added another field goal, Kramer added another interception, and the Eagles finished off the turnover game with a touchdown, winning 31-16. After returning to the class of the NFC Central with a division title in 1980, the Vikings took a step back over their next 4 seasons, finishing 4th in the Central 3 times and 5th once, with their best record coming in 1983 at 8-8, just a year after moving into the brand new Metrodome. Of course, Minnesota did make the playoffs in a strike-shortened season in 1982 with a 5-4 record, and even won a playoff game over the Falcons, who amazingly scored 3 special teams touchdowns, with a final score of 30-24. But the Vikings fell to the eventual Super Bowl champion Redskins in the divisional round, 21-7. In '83, following the 8-8 season, legendary coach Bud Grant retired, and the Vikings were in search of a new coach for the first time since 1967. In '84, the loss of Bud Grant was felt heavily. Les Steckel took over, and he was a disaster, trying to implement a Marine-style approach. He was a Vietnam vet after all, and it did not work, as the Vikings finished with their worst record in decades at 3-13. Steckel was fired, and the Vikings were back to the drawing board. In 1985, after the Les Steckel experiment failed miserably, Bud Grant was back. For a year, only. The Vikings took a step toward normalcy, although they still had a down year by their standards, with a 7-9 record. After '85, Bud Grant retired, for good this time, and Jerry Burns took over. In Burns' first year, the Vikings took another step forward and finished second in the NFC Central with a 9-7 record, but missed the playoffs. In 87, the regular season was similar, with an 8-7 record, but this time they made the playoffs. Burns' playoff debut was one to remember, when the Vikings dominated the Saints in the wild card round, 44-10, and as massive underdogs, defeated the Joe Montana-led Niners in the divisional round, 36-24, highlighted by tremendous play from sack artist Chris Dolman and receiver Anthony Carter, who had well over 100 receiving yards in the first half alone. After the stunning upset over the Niners, it appeared as though Jerry Burns was here to stay, and although the Vikings fell to the Redskins in the NFC title game the following week, 10-17, due to struggles offensively at the goal line, Minnesota finally had some stability at the coaching position in the post-Bud Grant era. In 1988, the Vikings finished 11-5, another step forward, as Wade Wilson took over for Tommy Kramer at quarterback. But the Vikings failed to get back to the NFC Championship. They defeated the Rams in the wildcard round 20-17, but were promptly showed the door the following week, this time by the Niners, losing in blowout fashion 34-9. In 1989, the Vikings were desperate to get over the top and made a franchise-altering move a few weeks into the season, trading for, yep, you guessed it, Heisman Trophy winner and Dallas Cowboys running back, Herschel Walker. In the infamous deal, the Vikings sent several players, multiple first-round picks, multiple second-round picks, and a third-round pick to Dallas for Walker. After the ridiculous trade that would haunt Vikings fans for years, Minnesota absolutely needed to get over the top. Dallas at the time was struggling, and this trade, well, we'll touch on how the trade impacted the Cowboys in another video. But the Vikings, they were all in, and Minnesota's GM at the time said the move was made to finally bring home a Lombardi. That season, Walker didn't have nearly the impact people thought he would, but the Vikings still managed to bring home their first NFC Central crown under Burns with a 10-6 record. In the playoffs, however, the move for Walker, who had 29 total yards in the game, once again wasn't enough, as the Vikings fell in the divisional round, again to the 49ers, who still hadn't forgotten the Vikings' stunning upset in 87, beating down Minnesota in blowout fashion again, 41-13. At the turn of the decade, the fallout from the Walker trade started to take effect, and Burns failed to achieve the success he had in years prior, missing the playoffs in both 1990 and 1991, with a 6-10 and an 8-8 record respectively. In 1990, Walker was, well, average, and in 1991, even after the Vikings re-signed Walker following comments from GM Mike Lynn saying they gave up too much for him, Walker was, again, uninspiring. Maybe it was due to him missing Vikings camp to try out for the U.S. Olympic bobsled team. I don't know, just a guess. In 1992, the Vikings finally caught Walker, hoping to move on to greener pastures they had grown accustomed to. Needless to say, the Cowboys won the trade, by a lot. After all, one of the picks Dallas got turned into Emmitt Smith.
Emmitt Smith has done it again.
It was something beautiful to watch.
Unbelievable how this guy makes people miss.
The bright spots for the Vikings in the first few years in the 90s were the additions of two Hall of Famers, wide receiver Chris Carter, who ranks top 10 in receiving touchdowns, and their backbone of the decade, defensive tackle John Randall, both of whom would play an integral role in good Vikings teams down the road. 1992 was the start of said greener pastures after the horrific Walker trade. Jerry Burns retired, and Minnesota moved on to Dennis Green, who had a lengthy coaching resume, but was most recently the head coach of Stanford, and was the second black head coach in NFL history. 92 was the year Minnesota started to return to normalcy, and by normalcy, of course, we mean sustained success while failing to achieve football's ultimate prize. In 92, the team finished 11-5, winning the NFC Central, a bounce-back season from the 8-8 finish in 91, but lost in the wildcard round to the Redskins, 24-7. In 93, the team took a step back record-wise at 9-7, while still making the playoffs, but, again, ended with the same result, a loss in the wildcard round, this time to the Giants, 17-10. And in 94, a step forward record-wise, albeit barely with a 10-6 record, but nevertheless won the NFC Central again, before being bounced in the wildcard round, again, this time by the division rival Bears in blowout fashion, 35-18. 95, 96, and 97 weren't much better. In 95, Minnesota missed the playoffs altogether at 8-8. In 96, they made the playoffs at 9-7, but were blown out by the Cowboys, who built a 30-0 lead by halftime and finished with a final score of 40-15. And in 97, the Vikings faithful were finally rewarded. Not with a spectacular record, they finished 9-7 again, but with a wildcard win, after losing 6 playoff games in a row. They stormed back in the waning minutes, thanks to a quick touchdown strike from Cunningham to Reed, an onside kick, and a late field goal, to beat the Giants 23-22, before being promptly showed the door in the divisional round against, the Niners, losing 38-22. Damn those Niners. Will they ever forget about 87? To be fair, it's amazing these Vikings teams competed as much as they did, and as well as they did, considering how much they had given up to the Cowboys in the Walker trade, who, believe it or not, actually got Walker back, and 3 Lombardi trophies along the way. But in 1998, Green was still the head coach, and in 97, Randall Cunningham took over at quarterback for Warren Moon. This was the start of something special in Minnesota. To pair with Chris Carter, the Vikings got an idea, a genius idea, to assemble arguably the greatest receiver duo in NFL history, when they drafted Randy Moss 21st overall in the 1998 NFL Draft. With Green, Cunningham, Carter, and Moss, the Vikings were loaded for bear. And in 1998, the Minnesota Vikings exploded. They rattled off 15 wins for an NFL best record 15-1, which included a dominant win over, the Dallas Cowboys, 46-36, in which Randy Moss became the first player in NFL history to have 3 50-plus receiving yard touchdowns. In 1998, Dennis Green won Coach of the Year. Randy Moss won Offensive Rookie of the Year. And this looked like it was finally the Vikings' year. After receiving a first-round bye, the 98 Vikings faced off against the Arizona Cardinals and did 98 Minnesota Vikings things, blowing out the Cardinals with a massive scoring outburst, 41-21, and were set to face off against the Atlanta Falcons in the NFC title game. But before we get to the NFC title game, it's important to point out that Gary Anderson, Vikings kicker, went perfect on extra points and field goals for the regular season. Anyways, let's carry on. In the title game, Atlanta started the scoring with a first drive touchdown, but Moss and Minnesota answered with a touchdown of their own. After a Falcons fumble and a Gary Anderson field goal, the Vikings grabbed a 10-7 lead, and after another Atlanta fumble, the Vikings continued doing 98 Vikings things, scoring another touchdown and then later adding another field goal to go up 20-7. The game was officially on blowout watch. Until a strip sack and a quick Falcons touchdown just before half calmed things down in the Metrodome, making the score 20-14 at the break. In the second half, the Falcons got a quick stop and added a field goal to cut the lead to 3. Thanks to some third down heroics from Carter and a great grab from Hatchett, the Vikings now took another 10-point lead in the fourth quarter, up 27-17. The Falcons answered again with a field goal, but after failing to convert on fourth down following the recovery of a Vikings fumble, the Falcons were starting to run out of time, until tragedy struck. Gary Anderson, remember him? The perfect kicker from the regular season? Well, his time is coming. The Vikings drove deep into the Falcons' territory, burning time off the clock, and 2 Falcons timeouts along the way, to set up a 38-yard field goal from Anderson that would put the Vikings up 10 and the game seemingly on ice. Then, this happened.
And it's not good.
Yes, Gary Anderson, the perfect Gary Anderson, hooked it left and hooked it hard. And with that, the underdog Falcons had breath. They had life. They had a chance to tie the game with 2:09 left on the clock. And tie it they did. The Falcons drove down the field, and after nearly throwing an interception and then nearly throwing another, the Falcons unbelievably tied the game. Yet still, the Vikings had 30 seconds and 2 timeouts. Dennis Green had 30 seconds. Dennis Green had 2 timeouts. Dennis Green had the most explosive passing attack in football. He had Randall Cunningham. He had Chris Carter. He had Randy bleeping Moss. Certainly his team with these weapons would push the ball down the field and into field goal range. Right? Wrong. Dennis Green elected to kneel out the clock? I mean, what was he thinking? With this litany of stars, how do you play it? You know what? Never mind. In overtime, which was sudden death in 98, the Vikings got the ball first. The Vikings punted, then got a stop, then punted again. This time, the Falcons drove into field goal range. They made the field goal. They were headed to the Super Bowl. And the 98 Vikings, yes, the plus 260 point differential, explosive Minnesota Vikings saw their best chance at a Lombardi since the 70s, end in crushing fashion. In 1999, Jeff George took over for Cunningham. The Vikings made the playoffs again and got their get back, again, against the Cowboys in the playoffs, but were then bounced by the greatest show on turf, who, ironically, the Minnesota Vikings were called first. 98. They really couldn't get it done in 98? Anyway, let's move on. At the turn of the millennium, the Vikings were still reeling after the heartbreak in 98, but did draft their future in the 99 draft, Dante Culpepper, 11th overall, the fourth quarterback off the board. In 2000, Culpepper took over as a starter in his second season and immediately flourished, leading the league in passing touchdowns, and star running back Robert Smith had a tremendous season of his own. The Vikings finished 11-5 and won the NFC Central for the second time in 3 seasons, getting a first-round bye. In the divisional round, they matched up with the Saints, and as expected, crushed them, 34-16. But in their second conference championship appearance, they were unable to atone for their shortcomings in 98, getting crushed in the NFC title, 41-0 by the Giants. After the 2000 season, Rob Smith retired at only 28 years old, and Vikings right tackle Corey Stringer, who was a first-round draft pick by the team several years earlier, tragically collapsed from heat stroke during training camp and died the next day. Following the retirement of Smith and the tragic loss of Stringer, the Vikings took a massive step back in 2001, finishing 5-11, and Dennis Green was let go before the season concluded. In 2002, not much improved under interim-turned-permanent head coach Mike Tice, with a 6-10 regular season finish, and a Randy Moss second-degree assault charge that was lowered from a felony to 2 misdemeanors. In 2003, the Vikings took a step forward under Tice after 2 down years, but still missed the playoffs in 9-7 after starting 6-0, then collapsing down the stretch, failing to beat the Cardinals in Week 17 to clinch the division in a playoff berth, when Arizona famously recovered an onside kick and threw a game-winning touchdown, in which famous Minnesota radio play-by-play analyst Paul Allen made this iconic call.
The Cardinals have knocked the Vikings out of the playoffs!
2004 wasn't much different, although Culpepper finally bounced back from a few down seasons to produce a career year, throwing for over 4,700 yards and 39 touchdowns. The Vikings finished 8-8 after starting 5-1, but making the playoffs this time and winning a wild-card game against hated rival Green Bay and Brett Favre, 31-17, a game in which Randy Moss did this.
Shoots the moon to the fans here in Green Bay.
But the Vikings inevitably lost to the Eagles in the divisional round the next week, who would represent the NFC in the Super Bowl. In 2005, the Vikings got new ownership when Ziggy Wilf purchased the team from Red McCombs and traded Randy Moss to the Raiders prior to the start of the season. After another mediocre year in 2005 and 9-7, in which Culpepper struggled on the field with multiple turnovers, as well as a knee injury, and off the field in the Vikings Bo Cruz scandal, in which Culpepper was charged for disorderly conduct, incident conduct, and lewd conduct, although the charges were inevitably dropped. Tice was let go, and Brad Childress took over. After the season, Culpepper requested a trade, or to be released if he wasn't traded. The Vikings dealt Culpepper to the Dolphins for a second-round pick. Childress struggled in his first year as head coach in 2006, with a 6-10 record. But Childress and the Vikings improved in 2007, after the Vikings selected, Adrian Peterson, 7th overall, in the 2007 draft.
Adrian Peterson.
Peterson had one of the most spectacular rookie seasons ever, with over 1,300 rushing yards and 12 touchdowns, including a Week 9 performance against the Chargers, in which he broke the single-game rushing record, with 296 yards. It looked like the Vikings finally had their answer at running back, after the failed Herschel Walker trade and the retirement of Rob Smith. In 2008, the Vikings won their first NFC North title, which was the Central, but changed to the North in 2002. Peterson continued to impress, but the Vikings simply could not get over the hump, with Gus Frerotte and Tavares Jackson at quarterback, and fell to the Eagles in the wildcard round, 26-14. In 2009, the Vikings needed a change at quarterback, and they turned to a familiar face. No, not Fran Tarkenton, although that would be funny. And no, not Bud Grant. That would be funny as well. This face was... Wait, let me make sure I'm reading this correctly. Brett Favre? Yes, Brett Favre. Packers legend Brett Favre. the quarterback that tormented the Vikings and other members of the NFC North for over a decade. This time, he was coming to Minnesota to avenge his unceremonious exit from Green Bay, when he was replaced by another guy, who we might talk about a little later. In 2009, with Favre under center, feels weird saying that, and Peterson in the backfield, the Vikings were in Super Bowl form again. They rattled off 12 wins, an NFC North title, and a first-round bye. They matched up with the Cowboys in the divisional round and blew them out, 34-3, and punched their ticket back to the NFC Championship for the first time in 9 seasons. This time, they matched up with the Saints. The Vikings jumped out to an early 7-0 lead on a Peterson touchdown, but the Saints answered with a 38-yard rushing touchdown to tie it at 7s. Favre answered again with another touchdown drive, retaking a 7-point lead. That was quickly nullified by the Saints again, tying the game at 14s going into the break. In the second half, the Saints opened the scoring to take a lead, 21-14, but Favre and the Vikings answered again, tying the game again. After Favre got hurt on a dirty hit from the Saints, one in a laundry list of such hits in the game, he returned. But the Vikings' Percy Harvin fumbled again, giving the Saints the ball deep in Vikings territory. The Saints cashed in, taking a 7-point lead, and the Vikings were in trouble in the fourth. With Favre on a hurt ankle, the Vikings defense answered the bell again. After fumbling again on the drive immediately after the Saints' touchdown, the Vikings forced a stop and drove down to tie the game at 28. In the waning minutes, the Vikings got the ball back, with a chance to kick the game-winning field goal, punching their ticket to the Super Bowl. Until Favre did this, and Paul Allen, voice of Vikings football, appropriately responded with this.
This is not Detroit, man. This is the Super Bowl.
After Favre's disastrous decision and Paul Allen's hilarious call, the game went to overtime. Any guesses on what happened next? The Saints won. Following the horrifying letdown in 2009, it'd be fair to wonder if the Vikings would ever get back to the Super Bowl. In 2010, the team took a massive step back with Favre still under center. And oh yeah, the roof of the Metrodome collapsed. That's okay, a new stadium was being built regardless. Anyway, Childress got fired mid-season, was replaced by Leslie Frazier, and the team finished 6-10. 2011 wasn't much better under Frazier. In fact, it was a lot worse, as the Vikings finished 3-13, and Adrian Peterson blew out his knee. But in 2012, coming off his horrific knee injury, Peterson exploded, and the Vikings bounced back. Adrian ran for over 2,000 yards, coming just 8 yards shy of the coveted single-season record. He won Offensive Player of the Year and MVP. The Vikings finished 10-6 in Leslie Frazier's second full season as head coach and with Christian Ponder now under center, but were bounced by Green Bay when Joe Webb was forced to start due to a Ponder injury, 24-10, in the wild card round. After another letdown season in 2013 at 5-10-1, Frazier was fired and Mike Zimmer was hired. In Zimmer's first year as head coach, the team took a step forward in 2014 with a 7-9 finish, but in 2015, the Vikings were back, winning the North at 11-5, but again losing in the wildcard round, this time to the Seahawks, 10-9, as the offense failed to get anything going. In 2016, they finished 8-8 and missed the playoffs, but in 2017, they exploded, winning 13 games in Zimmer's fourth season as head coach. The defense was stout, boasting a depth chart oozing with talented players like Harrison Smith, Xavier Rhodes, Everson Griffin, Danielle Hunter, Anthony Barr, and Eric Kendricks. With Case Keenum having a season for the ages by his standards, will this finally be the Vikings' year? In the divisional round, the Vikings matched up with the Saints. In a game that felt mostly in the Saints' control, the Vikings found themselves in a tough spot, with no timeouts and only a few seconds left on the clock, needing a touchdown to win. Well, this happened. After the Minneapolis Miracle, the Vikings matched up with the Eagles in the NFC Championship, with backup Nick Foles starting for Philly. Would this be the year? It would not. Foles stayed hot. Philly, the 2017 team of destiny, rolled Minnesota 38-7 and went on to win the Super Bowl. In 2018, the Vikings turned to Kirk Cousins. Finally, some stability at quarterback. Maybe. The Vikings finished 8-7-1 in Cousins' first year under center and missed the playoffs, but finished 10-6 the following season, making the playoffs, and were matched up in the wildcard round with the Saints. Oh boy. In another thriller, the Vikings got the best of New Orleans again in a dramatic overtime victory, although it still feels like no win over the Saints could atone for 09. What say you, Vikings fans? After the overtime victory, the Vikings faced off with the Niners in the divisional round, and were quickly shown the door 27-10. The Niners went on to represent the NFC in the Super Bowl, and, well, lost to this guy. In 2020, the Vikings took a step back, finishing 7-9, but the good news was the arrival of this guy, and his gritty. In 2021, it was more of the same, finishing 8-9. The Vikings' defensive core, other than Harrison Smith, had mostly aged out, and Zimmer was fired following the season. In response to Zimmer's firing, the Vikings hired this guy, Kevin O'Connell, offensive coordinator of the Super Bowl champion Rams, and well, things turned around. In a big way. The Vikings finished 13-4 with their rookie head coach. Justin Jefferson won Offensive Player of the Year, and the Vikings went an incredible 11-0 in one-score games. Wow. Would this be the Vikings year? In the wildcard round, they matched up with Daniel Jones and the Giants, who barely squeaked into the playoffs. Looks like the Vikings were headed to the divisional round. Until they weren't, losing their first one-score game of the season, 31-24, in the playoffs. 2023, the Vikings took a major step back. Kirk Cousins blew out his Achilles, Nick Mullins took over as starter, and the Vikings regressed toward the mean in one-score games, finishing 7-10. After the season, the Vikings let Cousins walk after 6 seasons with the team and drafted J.J. McCarthy, national championship winning quarterback out of Michigan, 10th overall in the following draft. In addition to McCarthy, the Vikings traded up for Dallas Turner as well, to bolster the defense after losing Danielle Hunter to the Texans. In what Vikings brass termed to be a competitive rebuild, they further bolstered the roster with the additions of Andrew Van Ginkel, Jonathan Grenard, Blake Cashman, Aaron Jones, and, oh yeah, this other guy, Sam Darnold. Well, after a solid showing in training camp in the preseason, J.J. McCarthy was set to be the starter, until he tore his meniscus. It was a rebuilding year anyway. Right? Wrong. The Vikings rattled off 5 straight wins to start the season, jumping on nearly every team they played, and beating down several Super Bowl contenders in the process. They blew out the Giants in Week 1, who weren't Super Bowl contenders, but continued their success against San Francisco, Houston, Green Bay, and the New York Jets, who were thought to be contenders, but definitely weren't. Sam Darnold was playing at an MVP level, the new defensive free agent acquisitions were balling, and the Vikings were 5-0, coming off a bye, to face 4-1 Detroit. In a dramatic game, in which the Vikings jumped out to an early lead, then battled back after giving up 21 unanswered points to take a 29-28 lead late in the fourth quarter, they had a chance to seal it on 3rd down. Until some miscommunication between receivers led to a Darnold overthrow. Detroit got the ball, marched down the field, and sealed to 10 Minnesota's hopes of a perfect season. No harm, no foul. The next week, they matched up with the Rams, and with the ball, down 8, needing 90-plus yards and a 2-point conversion to tie the game, a missed face mask call resulted in a safety. And the Rams handed the Vikings their 2nd loss of the season. Okay, 5-2, so what? After that, the Vikings got rolling again, rattling off 9 straight wins, including an overtime thriller against the Bears, a stellar comeback against the Cardinals, and gutsy wins against the Seahawks and Packers to set up a divisional round showdown at Ford Field against the Lions. The Vikings were 14-2, the Lions were 14-2, it was winner take all. The North, the 1 seed, everything was on the line. And with the Vikings playing hot and Detroit's defense struggling, it started to look like this season, that was once thought to be a rebuild year, could finally be the year the Vikings get over the hump. Until it wasn't. Multiple missed 4th down throws by Darnold and a drop pick 6 later, the Vikings were headed for the wildcard round. The first ever 14-win wildcard team in NFL history was matched up with the Rams. Wait a minute, didn't they play Detroit and LA back-to-back once already this season? Uh-oh. As they say, history often repeats itself, and this would be no different. The Rams used a similar scheme the Lions did. Sam Darnold, who was once playing like an MVP candidate, struggled mightily again, with the NFL world watching, and the Vikings lost, again, 27-9. 14-4 on the year, with their only losses coming against 2 teams, Detroit and LA. Is there anything more Minnesota? While heartbreaking, here's the bright side. The Vikings are far from finished. Many key players are returning, including the trio of defensive studs they signed before 2024. McCarthy, the heir, will be back. They still have Jefferson, they still have Addison, and they still have Kevin O'Connell. The Vikings have a lot of cap space, and while some holes certainly need to be filled along the offensive line and maybe in the secondary, the future is bright in Minnesota. This story, for now, is over. And 2024 was simply a footnote in the most tremendously successful failure that is Minnesota Vikings football. The Vikings are incredible. They're a well-run franchise with good ownership and a proud fan base, who every Sunday home game, win or lose, you'll hear chanting "Skol." Only time will tell if Minnesota will ever get over the hump. With their cast of characters, they've got as good a chance as ever.